Zach, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, my
So I want to
pleasure.
I want to start this off by bringing up something that you said in an interview. So you said that you got hooked on running because it made you feel a little bit of success, which you weren't really used to having. Could you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I would say like generally speaking, I had enough success with running that kept me interested in it at an early age, I suppose, but it wasn't something where my trajectory within kind of, I guess, the region or the area I was competing in was oftentimes kind of placing me at the top. So like for example, in high school, I was, good enough to be the top runner on the team, make the state meet and things like that. But I wasn't usually contending for like a podium at state or to win state or anything like that in cross country or track and field for that matter. And then college was kind of a similar situation. I was good enough to make the team, compete on the varsity squad, but like in terms of like scoring points at nationals or becoming an All-American and things like that, that just wasn't something that I was achieving. So when I sort of moved from kind of the more traditional Olympic distance races to focus on ultra marathon running, I had like maybe a higher tier of success in the sense that there were races I was winning or records I was breaking, which was like kind of a new piece to the experience for me.
Hell yeah. And how do you think your mindset has changed since you started running?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely changed. I think kind of early on, I thought of running as sort of a way to like express my physical abilities and to, you know, participate in competition, sport, and things like that. I was always very active and was eager to do active things. So, like, sport just made sense, and running was something that I think I just sort of gravitated towards more and more as I got kind of into the high school age. So that was like a big driver was, being able to be doing something active and then, finding somewhere that I was going to be successful at or have the opportunities to be successful at. In college, it changed a bit. It got to more of I mean, I kind of maintained some of those same mindsets and same values that I considered running was providing me, but I sort of just expanded upon it and found other things that I think is sort of natural when you start doing something for a long period of time. If your mindset or your reasons don't evolve, you find it to probably just get a little stale after a while because you're just doing things on repeat at that point versus kind of finding the additional value that you're going to get through experience and just further interest and deeper dives into the subject areas around it. So in college, I just got a lot more interested in more understanding kind of the hows and the whys and like what's actually happening when you do a specific type of workout or when you structure summer training differently than in-season training and things like that. So that was kind of another component with it. And then all the things that kind of go with that, where you start kind of uncovering all sorts of things like how does nutrition, how does sleep, how do all these other like things that you're doing that are going to impact your training and racing, but aren't actually the doing of the training and racing. So I had a kind of a different mindset with it in college from that direction. And then that was enough of an experience to teach me that I just enjoyed that process. And it was something that was going to be a value add in terms of kind of how I structure going about anything I'm interested in. So post college, I didn't really have any ambitions of becoming a professional runner at the time for reasons kind of related to what I mentioned before. I just wasn't like, capable of really having a solid trajectory to be signing pro contracts and taking a swing at something like the Olympics or something like that. So running was something I had to consider as a hobby essentially that is going to come at the expense of other things because I was going to be working a job that would be different than that. And through that experience, I did really learn just kind of the value of using the frameworks that you draw out, the planning, the scaffolding, the short-term and long-term goals and things like that from training are very applicable into other areas like your career and stuff like that. And through that, I eventually did find myself in a position where running professionally and kind of building a career around the sport of running was an option. And, then my mind shift changed again to some degree because now it is an activity that directly feeds into both kind of a passion, but not only just as a hobby, but as a profession and a revenue stream. So just like anyone would view their job in their career, you want to make advancements, you want to be proactively making gains, so to speak, or adding positives versus taking step backs or faltering and stagnating. So running sort of took a different approach in the sense that it became more than just a hobby at that point. And I would say like all that stuff has sort of lingered to some degree as motivators and reasons for doing it to this day. It's just kind of a compiling of all those experience to get to where I have been.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think were some mindsets or like mental models that you had when you started running in high school and college that served you well and kind of got you to the point where you are today?
Yeah, the one that sticks out the most is definitely just, and this is probably more college than I would say high school, but just kind of like the idea that like, patience and finding your reason for being there is important to make it sustainable because you're just going to have setbacks and you're going to have things that are maybe you assumed were going to be a motivator that no longer are or just simply aren't. So I find that like figuring out that I actually just really enjoyed the process of running and the rewards you get from more of an individual growth than a competition side of things. Not that the competition wasn't still motivating, it just wasn't something that I think I would look at as like an isolation. It's something that would be like motivating long term in isolation without the other things. So with high school and college, some of it was just like figuring out, well, how do I take another step forward, regardless of whether that's going to move me up on the team or beat a competitor. I think the races and things like that tended to be more short term motivators where it's like, okay, I've been doing this training modal that I think is going to produce a better result, and getting on a starting line with other competitors is going to be the environment that's going to bring the best out of me. So having the opportunity to compete was something that allowed me to better express whether those inputs were working well or if I needed to make any sort of changes.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like even though having a race and having the competition is a good motivator, that only like it's only short term and it's not like a long term sustainable motivator. So I guess you got to find other things that are more intrinsic. So what was your reason why when you were starting out?
What was that again?
What was like your why
It right now or kind of at the beginning?
at the beginning?
Yeah, at the beginning, I didn't really actually see running as a sport necessarily. Yeah, I got
Yeah.
into other sports early, and it wasn't until I was introduced to like track and field, and we did like the presidential physical fitness, which had a running component to it, where I realized that like there wasn't really this scenario of you're kind of good or bad or on some spectrum of good or bad at all sports. It's more of a, yeah, if you're really good at certain athletic things, you'll probably translate to being good at a variety of different sports, but there is some individual variance there. Kind of the most obvious one to me was like, I could have a classmate who would just, you know, bury me in like a 60-meter or 100-meter dash or something short like that, but then I might beat them by a fair margin in the mile. And it just was kind of a new experience for me to realize that like they're both running, but they're just different in enough of a way that you can be in a situation where at one you're better than just kind of naturally at that age because nobody was training specifically for anything, at least not my classmates at that age. So I think it was like my first why was just mostly because it was a sport that I really was more successful at than probably some of the other ones, or it just stood out to me. So I mean, even then though, I would say I didn't even really think of it as a why because at that point even in high school for the most part. It wasn't until the end of that where I started looking at running as even the primary sport. So it was part of a mixture of other sports that I would do, other activities that I would do. And then when it got to things that were a little more specific, like track and field and cross country, there wasn't a whole lot. It was kind of like with track and field, especially, it's like, well, then you are picking, because obviously there's a big range between throwing the shot put and running the 3,200 meter or something like that. So when it came to track and field, it was like I was going to gravitate towards the distance stuff because that's what I was better at. Cross country was a little more clear because if you're doing cross country, you're running. So it was just kind of like, am I going to do cross country or not? And it just seemed like by the time I was a sophomore in high school, that seemed like the priority sport in the fall for me. So I would kind of focus on that. But really, like, my first like real parent why, I think, outside of just being active and participating in sports, was probably my sophomore year in high school. I overachieved my expectations going into the cross country season. And we had a team that had a pretty strong junior and senior class that year relative to what we had most years. So I was, finding myself in a situation where early in the season, I had no anticipation of running with or better than most of them. But by the end of the year, I found myself running with or ahead of a lot of them. So I was in a situation where, like, the next year, the juniors that would be coming back, I had been beating that year consistently. The seniors that would beat me were graduating. So there was the likelihood that I was going to be, the top runner on the cross country team the following year was much higher. So I think I started taking that a little more seriously, but not enough to even start training year round. And it wasn't until my junior year, I had a cross country coach who was probably the first adult in my life who just was actually into running. Like, he actually loved running and did it himself. It wasn't like, oh, we need to fill this coaching job, who's available? And he actually wanted to do it. He wanted to share his experience. He wanted to share his excitement. And that was kind of like a motivator in that, like, he really showed to me, he's like, this isn't something where, like, you're going to find your best self by just showing up on day one of cross country practice and starting the process there. This is a scenario where if you do something in the summer, from a training standpoint, or if you train year round to some degree, you're probably going to find yourself in a better position to compete. And then, like, just really kind of hammering home, like, both the individual and the team component to that. So then I had, like, kind of multiple whys where we had this goal that he sort of instilled in us, where it was, you have an opportunity, if you do your best, to make the state meet. So then it became kind of a goal that season to try to qualify both as an individual and as a team for the state cross country meet. So that was probably my first really obvious why, was through him and kind of his vision with running and his experience with running, where most of it kind of like built from, in terms of something that was going to be an activity that I was interested in the long term, versus just kind of another sport that you more or less graduate from, unless you're doing like some sort of like rec basketball or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it was at the start, it was more just because you really enjoyed running and, like, it was something you're passionate about.
Yeah. Yeah. It was definitely kind of more along the lines of, I was still learning to be passionate about running for the sake of running through most of high school. Yeah. And I would say even, even beyond that to some degree too, I think there's just like, I became very passionate about running by the end of high school. And I was definitely passionate about it in college and after college, but generally speaking, I think that's kind of an area that also evolves, because, like, even now, I've been running for about 25 years, and I have had successes where, like, if I stopped competing, I would have a reasonably strong resume that I could look back on and be like, well, that was worth it. But then at that point, it's like, what is your purpose to doing things if that competition, or if that level of, if your abilities start to kind of head the opposite direction, which they ultimately do as you age, is it something where you're still going to have that activity and find purpose for it? So kind of just being further along in my career and having, some time to kind of reflect on like, well, what will I do when I find that like it's pretty clear that I'm not going to run my fastest race anymore, and it's more about like doing the sport for other purposes than, direct competition. Then what are those? And so some of the things like that have sort of just shown me that it is probably an activity I'll include in some capacity even after I retire as like a professional athlete, is just sort of the way that it sort of fits in the day and what it provides for like how you feel. Almost like, there'll be a day where like you don't run for one reason or the other. Maybe it's even planned, and you just kind of recognize, I just don't feel like I started the day, or I don't feel like I really kind of got off on the right stride for everything else I'm doing. And you sort of just reflect back on that as like, maybe it felt good to like, sleep in or skip that workout at the time. But after you get past that initial like relief of, oh yeah, I guess I don't have to do this, the rest of your experience feels almost like you bailed out on something. And I think you could probably replace that with other things too, but they probably would have to be some sort of physical expression, I would imagine. Running is just one where I find it is, a pretty simple activity to kind of include. It's a very transferable activity in the sense that like you can do it almost anywhere, and the environment in which you can do it can change if you lose interest in one kind of environment versus another. And it kind of has that flexibility to it where, whether I'm traveling or at home or in a place that's got trails and mountains or a place that's got roads and tracks, there's a way to kind of do something with it.
Oh, totally. And I've actually been running at the start of like every day for the past few weeks, and I've been feeling so good just because I've been starting the day off with a win, and then I guess that just like puts me in like such a good mood, and it leads the way to more wins throughout the day, and I guess just creates momentum. But
Hmm.
one thing I find I struggle with when I do long distance runs is that I get so many negative thoughts, and I guess I, I guess like part of me is like wanting to give up, wanting just to go home, sit on my couch, but the other part of me wants to keep going, and I guess it's kind of hard. Like it's been hard to just tune out those negative thoughts and keep going when I do the long distance runs. And I'm guessing that's something that you've struggled with as well with your running, or like something that has happened to you as well. So how do you deal with those thoughts when they come up?
Yeah, it's definitely not uncommon. And it's something where depending on the type of workouts you're doing, there's different kind of versions of that. I find that there are like, the negative self-talk is probably the way to describe that, is going to kind of be there. And, let's say you're doing something shorter and faster, you might get negative self-talk from that too. It just depends on kind of how you're viewing it. So I look at a lot of those as just things that are going to be like kind of a sign where it's sort of like typically what I find in life is like if something comes really easy, then the balance there is likely that the reward for that is going to be quite small or trivial relative to something that's more difficult. That tends to be more in line with things that are going to be more rewarding. So it's kind of this like delayed gratification type of a scenario where when I see those situations happen in my own running, I ask myself, it's like, is this something where I know if I'm able to persevere, I'm going to have another win that is going to make not only this day feel like more of accomplishment, but also give me more confidence towards being able to do that when it's more consequential, like at a race.
Yeah.
Um, and just kind of balancing that out with just like the relative ebbs and flows of training load and stress and what you need to actually do to get better. Because with running, it is one of those things where, it does attract a lot of kind of like type A people where they're looking for perfection, they're looking for continual progress, and they're trying to see that. And eventually though, you need to do things like take a rest day or take an off season or maybe not progressively load a specific workout for a little bit of time just so that you're able to make that sustainable and something where you do continue to see adaptations properly get expressed because you're matching the stressors with enough recovery. So, there's a balance there too with recognizing whether are you getting an increased amount of negative self-talk because you're sort of throttling a little too hard and you need to actually maybe take a little bit of a step back. I don't know that that's necessarily the case most of the time, but it is definitely something to be aware of too. So what I find is you usually find a pretty good balance where those sort of mindset or those sort of like negative self-talks will have a frequency that seems a little bit more appropriate for what you're doing. Or the way I like to look at it is like for any given week, I'm going to have a few runs where I just am really loving it. And when I finish, I'm telling myself if I could go further or faster, I would, but it's, the job is done. It's time to move on to the next stage of the day or the next stage of the plan. And there's going to be days where it's just kind of more neutral, where it's like, I don't hate it, but I don't love it. I'm not bothered by it. I know I should be doing it, so I do it. And then there's going to be a day or two where I'm out there and I'm just like, why am I actually doing this? And I find like, if you accept that there's going to be that range and there's going to be a balance of that is sustainable, which you can sort of track over time, especially when you're seeing improvements, you can sort of like make adjustments based on how far you deviate from that. So like if I'm only enjoying my running and never having days where I feel like, you know what, do I really want to be out here? I'm probably not loading to any degree that I'm going to see an adaptation that's going to get me to my best race. So I may have to make some adjustments in training. Or on the opposite end, if I'm seeing those negative self-talk situations pop up more and more frequently, where now instead of it being a day or two during the week or a workout or two during the week, it ends up being like every morning I wake up and I'm just like second guessing why I'm doing this. I'm spending 15 minutes tying my shoes because I'm just trying to avoid going out for that run. Yeah. That's a sign to me that like we're increasing the frequency above and beyond what should be expected in terms of your view of the activity. And that could be a sign that something in the input side of things isn't sustainable. So, maybe you're not getting enough sleep. Maybe you're not getting enough rest in between workout sessions. Maybe the excitement of starting to run or starting a new program got you out the gate a little too fast and you need to do a deload week or just pull back a little bit. These are all just kind of, I think, lessons that a lot of times people generally will learn through trial and error if they stick around long enough. But if you can go in knowing about that, then it can help you course correct a little quicker. And then you may make fewer of those mistakes or find yourself less likely hitting that kind of point where you're making that adjustment.
Yeah, great point. And something that you said on a podcast that I found to be super interesting was you love running so much that it's almost like you're addicted to it. So how do you kind of deal with that addiction to running and make sure it doesn't really go too far and consume you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's definitely something where you can be a victim of your own desires to some degree with stuff like running and anything for that matter, where it sort of goes back to part of what I was just saying almost, where I have to recognize kind of the biological signs and the things that are going to be like clear, objective reasons to suggest that I'm doing it wrong or doing it for the wrong reasons. So if I decide like I'm really motivated to try to run a certain number of hours for a week or a certain number of miles or do a certain number of workouts, I can look at that and be like, okay, I have to do this. Or I can look at it and be like, this is my best guess based on prior experience, everything I know about running inputs and training load and things like that, that is going to be like the likely path forward. But if I'm ignoring those signs I just described in terms of kind of how I'm actually like feeling and recovering from runs and things like that, your passion can get the best of you to some degree. So it's kind of just like a sustainability thing where I think part of the delayed gratification side of running isn't just the intra workout kind of negative self-talk side of things, but it's also something where it's like, if you want to be doing this for a long period of time and enjoying it maximally, you have to be mindful of how much of it you do in any given one session. And this bears out a lot of times in just individual workouts, in the sense that I like to follow kind of a general approach, whether it's speed workouts or any intensity really for that matter, is like when I finish, I shouldn't feel like, unless it's a race day where I'm trying to really just fully exhaust myself, I shouldn't feel like I've totally drained at the end of it. If I'm totally drained at the end of it, the likelihood of that kind of stealing from tomorrow is very high. So you want to, I find if you stop feeling like, okay, short intervals, I could do one or two more. Long intervals, I could maybe do one more if I had to. Your typical base, like foundational runs, if you had to keep running, you could, but you stop because you hit the goal and it's time to kind of recover and keep it sustainable for the next day. Those are just things I think you oftentimes learn where like I could always run more than what I typically do in most cases outside of being injured, I suppose. But I know that if I just try to run as much as I can physically tolerate, there's a margin of diminishing return somewhere. And, for someone like myself who's been running as long as I have, I've more or less kind of teased out where those often are.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Because I guess you've done it for so long that you really have a good understanding of yourself and your limits.
Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely things that you learn to tease out of like the data too. I think the interesting thing about running is like perceived effort is still one of the better gauges that you can use once you kind of learn to know like what does it feel like to run a specific intensity that you're targeting. But from there, you can do a lot with data analysis and things like that. So something as simple as if I do like if I do a short interval session and I look at the data afterwards and I notice that, say, my pace at a given intensity is starting to kind of fade or get a little worse at the end of intervals or at those end stages of the interval set I'm doing, it's starting to get a little slower. That could be a sign that I'm not calibrated right for that. So
Yeah.
if I go about that training modal with that same kind of mind or with ignoring that, then I probably will find myself in a situation where now it's not going to be sustainable. And then some of those negatives that we talked about before start kind of creeping in, or you get injured or something like that. So some of it is like just also having the experience, but also knowing what to look for in your own training data and things like that to be able to say like, okay, today wasn't quite perfect. And that's not going to be a problem for a single workout most of the time. But if I compound that for 3, 4, 5 workouts, it could and probably will eventually. So making those minor adjustments based on some of that more short-term data that you can kind of analyze and look at can get you kind of more precise along the way. And then you're just more likely to kind of maintain the positives and minimize the negatives that are going to come along for kind of pushing your limits with something like training.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So something that you said in a podcast, it was that it's hard to know what your true potential is if you don't know what your potential is right now. I thought that was pretty interesting. So could you go a bit deeper on that?
Yeah, so I think if you're not like actually like finding where your limitations are in the moment, it's going to be hard to kind of extrapolate forward to find out what you're capable of. And
Yeah.
I don't know that you necessarily have to think of it that way though. I think like there is a lot of value to living in the moment in the sense that no matter how bad you want to achieve like some goal that's likely years in the future, if you're not taking advantage of some of the stuff that needs to be done to get to that and recognizing those as wins, then you can get ahead of yourself very quickly and oftentimes lose interest in what should be kind of positive rewards and things like that. So
Yeah.
a lot of it does become like a realistic nature to it where kind of looking at where you're currently at is going to be where you want to start still, especially when it comes to training. You don't want to like say, okay, I'm just starting to run and I'm going to look at someone who's been running for 10 years and just replicate what they're doing, because they likely got to that point because they took small steps versus big steps. And finding reasonable short-term targets, knowing that those are going to be things that if you can kind of consistently do those year after year after year, you likely can achieve things that are going to be more than maybe what you're aware of at the moment. But I mean, if I even look at my own running journey, I mean, I had limitations that I placed on myself throughout my entire career that I don't necessarily see as limitations long term because they allowed me to stay realistic in the moment versus getting too far ahead of myself and starting to try to do things that were possible but weren't wise in the moment either. So I had an interview with Steve Magnus a while back, who is he's just got a great story in terms of, I guess he's got a great story in terms of kind of maybe how to not go about things, but he's
Oh yeah.
since become very, very wise in kind of the training and the approach, both physically and mentally with running. And one thing he said that I think would made a ton of sense was you have to be able to think locally when it's time to think locally, and then think regionally when it's time to think regionally, and then think globally when it's time to think globally. So if you have somebody who's in a position in their running journey where they should be thinking locally, if they're having expectations placed on them that are more global and they're targeting things that are more global, they're ahead of themselves, and the likelihood of that backfiring on them is just much greater versus somebody who is like, I'm new to running. Where are the wins for me right now? And what should I kind of, you don't have to ignore it, but not necessarily overemphasize, because it may be something that I get to, but it's just not where I am at right now.
Yeah, so I guess like having that long-term vision, knowing where you want to be in like 5, 10 years, but at the same time just taking everything day by day.
Yeah. And it's just like basic scaffolding, I think, concepts too, that you can kind of apply to both your training and to like your long-term goal setting and things like that, where in order to get to the point you want to be, there's a lot of things that need to be done. And if you get too far ahead of that, then you can lose sight of what you should be doing in the moment. Or I mean, people, I think we do these things intuitively a lot. We just don't
Yeah.
always like see them as like reference points for this. So like when I think of some of the other areas of life where like if I'm trying to work on like a big project or something like that, and I know what that end project I want it to look like, but it doesn't really matter what I need to be doing on day 9 of 10 if I haven't started day 1 yet. It's like I should have an idea of what I'll be doing on day 9 of 10, but I shouldn't be worrying about that while I'm working on day 1. So there's like this almost passive background knowledge of where you want to be or what you have to do when you get there, but and you can be working on those, but you want to be very present in the sense that in order to make that a reality, the first things have to happen first.
Yeah, makes total sense. So you say that a lot of successful runners or successful people they have a temporary shift in their focus from what their main goal and objective is. So could you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just like something that generally I found interesting with like ultra running specific to me. And I think probably people who find themselves focusing on a long-term goal for long periods of time is just you have there's a fatigue of doing things over and over and over again. So in order to kind of maintain the freshness that is going to present like the excitement for something, I think taking a step back from it can oftentimes be helpful to kind of reignite that. So with ultra running, the nice thing is there's just so many different environments and different distances that you can train for. So
Yeah.
you know everyone's probably going to have a distance or a course or an event that they think this is my favorite, but too much of a good thing can be fatiguing and problematic if you don't rest from it. So from one thing that I'll usually do is I'll do other races and train even specifically for races that I typically would not find the most exciting portion of the sport for me, in order to give myself like a break from the stuff that I'm more interested in kind of really fine tuning over a career. So I may sacrifice a season to preserve like a career goal, or make that career goal something that is still exciting and still motivating to me. So that might be like, I tend to prefer more runnable courses. So like that might mean stepping away from a course that is very runnable and doing something that's got a little bit more of a component like uphill running or downhill running and things like that, or that has a hiking component to it or a more technical terrain component to it, or even just a different distance. So that I find is just, it shifts the training and it shifts the experience enough where then when you go back to what previously was sort of a routine that you had done rinse and repeat a number of times, it feels more fresh and new again, and you kind of can reignite the excitement for it. Some people will do this like with totally other sports. So I think it's the individuality is going to be how much of a variance do you need to hit the reset button for you personally. So, some people will take time away from the sport entirely where, they're not doing any sort of race for a year, or maybe they switch to like mountain biking or something for a while. Or one thing I think we see a lot of within the pro runners and ultra running now, especially on the mountain running side, is they may do like a winter sport like ski mountaineering or something like that, where they might barely run at all for a few months during the year, but the sport they are doing is a solid contributor to their development as a runner. And then once they get back to being more specific with the running thing, those developments take place. And the ski mountaineering or the activity they're doing that was essentially cross training is actually a supportive measure versus something that's a distraction from what they're ultimately trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. Because I guess if you do one thing like running just all the time for a super long time, that can wear you out, and then kind of start to take a toll on your progress. So you start regressing after a while rather than progressing.
Yeah, and I think running is a sport where the injury rate is incredibly high. I think it's like
Yeah.
9 out of 10 people get an injury. So it's like it's one of those things where I find a lot of times people will find that an injury does this for them, where they start grinding long enough and hard enough where eventually they do pick up some sort of a an injury because they just overreached, and then they're forced to take a step back, and that kind of time away that's forced is a pretty big motivator when you get back to not take some of the things that you're maybe starting to get a little more complacent on for granted, and you can reignite it that way. But if you're someone who's generally stayed healthy, you have to be mindful of kind of pre-programming that sort of stuff into your calendar year, or years in some cases, as you're kind of going through this. And Olympic athletes probably have like a structure for this that's fairly sound, because they have annual goals and things like that from one season to the next. But a lot of them, if they have that trajectory, are going to be trying to maximize things every 4 years for the Olympics. So they may have a scenario where, like, all right, after the Olympic Games, I have a period of time where it's not proactive for me to be thinking about 4 years from now in terms of what I should be doing from training. So this is an opportunity for me to take a little bit of a downtime and let everything kind of catch back up before kind of beginning that cycle again.
Yeah, totally. So, how has visualization helped you with your running? And how do you visualize for your races?
Whereas, yeah, so I think with just generally speaking, what I like to do is I like to look at kind of the visualization side of things as, on race day, I'm going to be in a situation where I have a lot that I'm trying to accomplish in that time frame, and it's going to be something where if I want to be aware of it all, but I don't want to be overthinking steps, too many steps ahead to the point where it gets overwhelming and creates a lot of negative self-talk or a lot of like mental draining thought processes. So you can kind of practice that in your training by, like, let's say you build out your training plan, and you look at like 4 weeks of it. If you look at that 4 weeks in totality, it's good to know what's there, but you don't necessarily want to be overly thinking about what you're doing on, say, day 10 when you're still on day one, because in order to get to day 10 and for day 10 to be successful, you need to first accomplish day one. So working on kind of like the mindset of like zooming in when it's appropriate to zoom in. So like in a race, if I'm early on, I want to be mindful of how hard I should be pushing to make it sustainable, but ultimately I also need to be zooming in as to like what is a manageable amount of this course or this race that I should be wrapping my head around right now, and taking it through those chunks. And those things are all available to you in your day-to-day life when you're kind of looking at your long-term plans and your short-term plans and how you're kind of visualizing those things.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, so basically just not really overdoing it, like not like over visualizing to the point where you're overthinking every little thing, but like just doing kind of a little bit, and take And I guess thinking about the run in chunks.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And the way I like to look at it is like ultimately, if you find yourself on the starting line of say a 100-mile race and you did the preparation for it, if you look at the totality of everything you did to prepare for that race, it's just massive compared to the race itself. So you want to look at it as, all right, well, I managed to compartmentalize all the little inputs that led to that, entire training plan that got me to the starting line. So I'm capable of doing this. Now I just need to practice all of that on race day in the race, which is just basically the same thing. Like if you did let's say you did a 24-week training plan, you weren't necessarily thinking about week 18 on week one. You were worried about doing week one properly in order to get to week 18. So on race day, when you're on the starting line, it may be overwhelming to think about 100 miles right at the starting line, but it won't be overwhelming to think about, I know I can do this because I proved that in my training. And now I just need to compartmentalize it the way I did in the training and take it one stage at a time and really chunk it like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in what ways has running helped you in other areas of your life, such as your podcast and like I know that you started your coaching business. Like what lessons have you learned while running that you've kind of transferred to those areas?
Yeah, it's basically the same process. It's just different, different things or different topics essentially. So like with coaching, just like I have an idea in running, like I would like to try to run this particular time for this particular race. Once I acknowledge that, I need to go back and look at, well, what are the processes that are going to require that to happen. So like for like the podcast, for example, if I want to say record my 400th episode, that's great. That's a goal. And if I'm at a point where I've recorded 400 episodes, chances are I found some success. So that's probably a reasonably like good goal to have as like an indicator of success. And but from there, I can't record 400 episodes before I've recorded, the first four even. So
Yeah.
I look at it kind of the same way where it's like, how do I make it to 400 sustainably? And getting there sustainably probably requires some success or I would stop somewhere along the way. So that means those first four episodes, I need to be focused on how can I make these as meaningful and as valuable as I can so that I can build off of them and eventually add four more, then four more, and then, keep learning along the way so that I'm making the adjustments I need to do, but also kind of maintaining the structure that I'm trying to do to get to that number. With coaching, it's kind of the same thing too, where it's like, there's definitely like a variety of different considerations there, just like there is with training. But ultimately, it's like if I want a coaching business that has, a wide range of offerings, it's regardless of whether I know ahead of time how I want that all to look. If I try to do them all at once, chances are they're all going to be mediocre or at least lower quality than they would if I give them their own due diligence and time to kind of really kind of set in and become efficient within them. So it can be like, well, which input is the best starting one? Which would be the kind of the launching spot where I can kind of start this process, and then what signs do I look for in terms of when have I reached success with this? And it's time to add another input because I can tolerate the extra workload to add it because I've gotten efficient enough with the previous one, and taking those at one step at a time. So it's basically the same structure. It's just, a different topic, but you want to kind of follow that same mode and just be open to kind of like the changing environment too. Like, with running, things have changed since I started in terms of like how to go about certain preparations, different gear to use and things like that. And, same with coaching. It's like over the years, like different training methodologies have gained and lost, the amount of focus they're given for specific circumstances and things like that. So sort of also being kind of a continual learner with it along the way is going to kind of help you sustain the things you've already built, but then put you in a position where you're also able to continue to grow that business too, because the other things are successful because you're not just kind of being stuck in some kind of dogmatic way of thinking.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. what kind of stuff do you do to make sure that things like running and your podcast are as sustainable as possible and you are enjoying it the most you can?
hmm Yeah, I mean it's the same thing as I think with training load with running, where there's signs you want to look for that will signal whether you're doing too much or not enough at certain times. So, with coaching and podcasting and things like that, is there, if I'm not doing enough to meet my goals, I may not notice that I may notice that I have a lot of extra free time, or I have like a lot of, I'm not doing things that would maybe otherwise be something I wouldn't always like to do. I like to keep some level of difficulty with it, because I find that usually means that I'm kind of doing things thoroughly versus just doing the components of it that I like versus the components I need to do to make the whole package successful. So, like with anything, there's going to be parts of that process that are less exciting than others. But then there's also going to be parts where if I'm getting too overly zealous, it'll be unsustainable. So a lot of it's just kind of like being realistic with how long certain tasks take, and then what's reasonable targets within that. So like if I start recording, say 3 or 4 podcast episodes a week, I might be able to sustain that for a little while, but over time, it may be too difficult to spend the time with the actual recordings, actually doing quality research for the guests, the editing and publishing process of that. So that may negatively impact my coaching business, because now all of a sudden I'm dedicating time I would have spent on that towards trying to hit this unsustainable podcast number. So there's just like a balance you kind of just learn over time, where you start to recognize how long do these certain things take, and then you stress test them so that it's a sustainable prediction of that. And then if that gets to a point where you're able to add more to it because you've had that all organized in a way where there's extra time to do it, then you can. But if you're starting to lose interest in things you were previously excited about, that can be a sign you're overdoing things and not giving yourself enough kind of breaks. Same thing with kind of training, where you could be doing something that you previously loved, but if you're doing too much of it, you may start losing that interest.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective and way of going about things. So Zach, this was a great podcast, and I'm super grateful to have had you on. The last question that I want to ask is a question that I ask a lot of my guests. So, what do you want to be remembered for?
That's a good question. I think probably more than anything, somebody who was generally interested and excited about what they were doing, and was doing it for more than just self-fulfillment, but also to kind of help grow the sport, introduce it to new people, and introduce like new ways of thinking and processes within it.
Love to hear, man. Well, it was such a pleasure to have you on, and you're making a great impact. So keep doing what you're doing, man.
Awesome. Well, thanks a bunch for having me on. It was great to chat.
Yeah, of course. Have a great day, Zach.
Take care.